10 doctors, 3 months, $4 billion, and not one of them could tell Franklin Aldridge why his daughters were disappearing. They had tried everything. Specialists flown in from 3 continents, experimental protocols, medications that cost more per dose than most people earn in a month. They had sat across from Franklin in their white coats and spoken in careful, measured language about atypical presentations and inconclusive markers and further observation. They had looked at his daughters like puzzles. None of them had looked at them like children. The answer, when it finally came, did not arrive in a laboratory. It did not arrive in a research paper or a consultation room or a specialist's office overlooking a city skyline. It arrived at 3:17 in the morning in a hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and quiet grief, carried by a man in a gray uniform pushing a yellow mop cart who had no medical degree and no reason to stop, except that he heard something. And unlike everyone else in that building, he actually listened. This is Everhart Tales, and this is the story of Elton Briggs, a man who swept floors, a man who carried the world, and a man who saw in 2 sick little girls exactly what 10 brilliant doctors had missed. Stay with me, because what happens next, nobody saw coming. There is a distinct kind of quiet that lives inside a hospital at 2 a.m. It is not peaceful. It is the quiet of people holding their breath, of families pressed into waiting room chairs, counting ceiling tiles, bargaining silently with something larger than themselves. It is the quiet of monitors beeping in steady, indifferent rhythms, of elevator doors opening onto empty hallways, of footsteps that echo just slightly too long before fading. Elton Briggs knew that quiet better than most. He had mopped its floors for 11 years. He moved through the 4th-floor corridor of Hargrove Medical Center the way he always did at this hour, steadily, without hurry, his yellow cart rolling ahead of him with its familiar low squeak. The antiseptic smell had stopped registering years. The sounds of the building, the distant beeping, the hum of ventilation, the occasional murmur from a nurse's station were so familiar they had become a kind of silence of their own. He was not supposed to matter tonight. He was supposed to mop the corridor, empty the bins in the family lounge, wipe down the surfaces in the shared bathroom at the end of the hall, and move on to the 5th floor before 4 a.m. He had a routine. He kept to it. 11 years, and he had almost never deviated. But at 3:17 a.m., he passed room 412, and the door was slightly open. A small lamp cast a warm triangle of gold light into the hallway. He registered it in his peripheral vision the way he registered most things on the overnight shift. Noted, filed, moved past. And then he heard it. Not crying exactly. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. The sound a child makes when they are trying very hard not to cry, when they have decided, for reasons no 7-year-old should ever have to develop, that crying is no longer worth the energy. Elton stopped. He stood in the hallway for a moment, his hand resting on the cart handle, and he thought about a rule he had kept for 11 years. Keep your distance, be respectful, be quick. Patients needed their privacy. Families needed their space. A janitor's job was to be invisible. He knocked lightly on the doorframe. The small face that turned toward him was pale and ancient in the way that illness makes children ancient. Eyes too tired for their age, expression carefully composed as though she had already learned to manage the reactions of adults around her. She was sitting up in the hospital bed, her twin sister asleep beside her, and she was staring at the window like people stare at windows when there's nothing left to stare at. "Can't sleep?" Elton asked softly. The girl shook her head. "Me neither, most nights," he said, "though in my case it's because I'm the one working." She didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted just slightly. The careful composure loosened just at the edges. Elton leaned against the doorframe, not coming in, not presuming anything, just present. "I've got a daughter," he said, keeping his voice low so as not to wake the twin sister. "She's 9. When she can't sleep, she talks to me about dragonflies until she's too tired to keep going." The girl looked at him. "Why dragonflies? Honestly, I've never figured that out." This time she almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. And Elton Briggs, who had spent 11 years learning to be invisible, stood in the doorway of room 412 at 3:17 in the morning and decided, quietly and without fanfare, that invisibility could wait. They had arrived 2 days earlier, the way wealthy families arrive at hospitals, in a convoy. 2 black SUVs pulling up to the main entrance at dusk, a personal assistant already on the phone before the doors opened, a private physician conducting a video call with the department head from the back seat. The hospital administrator had been notified an hour in advance. The 4th floor's east wing had been quietly cleared and prepared. Franklin Aldridge stepped out of the first vehicle and stood for a moment on the pavement, looking up at the building with the expression of a man who was accustomed to solving problems, and was beginning to understand that some problems did not care how many resources you had. He was 51 years old, broad and solid, with the kind of face that probably was handsome before exhaustion moved in and rearranged things. He had built a logistics empire from a single warehouse lease at age 26. He had navigated recessions, regulatory battles, hostile acquisitions, and market collapses. He had faced boardrooms full of adversaries and never once walked out of a room without what he came for. His daughters were sick, and he had nothing. The twins, Nora and Nell, 7 years old, were lifted gently from the second vehicle in wheelchairs. They wore matching pale blue sweaters. Their hands, as the attendants rolled them toward the entrance, reached across the gap between them and found each other without either of them looking. It was a practiced, automatic gesture of 2 people who have learned to hold on. They did not speak. They used to sing in the back seat of cars, a nurse would later tell a colleague. Silly songs they made up themselves, trading verses back and forth, dissolving into laughter at their own terrible rhymes. Their mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier, quietly and too young, had once recorded a video of them doing it on her phone. Franklin had watched that video so many times in the past 3 months that he had stopped watching it at all, because he could not afford in this season the quiet grief of before. Now they held hands and were quiet. Their faces had taken on a papery, translucent quality. Their eyes, once bright and quick with mischief, had dimmed to something careful and tired. 3 months earlier, it had begun as fatigue, both girls within days of each other. Appetite gone, energy gone, that unmistakable shine that healthy children carry simply gone. Franklin had assumed a virus. His physician had assumed the same. But it hadn't passed. What followed was a season that Franklin would later describe to a journalist, once and only once because he did not enjoy revisiting it, as the most expensive confusion of his life. A rheumatologist in New York found nothing conclusive. A pediatric neurologist in Boston identified irregular patterns but could not connect them to a diagnosis. A specialist in rare metabolic disorders, flown in from Stockholm at considerable cost, offered a theory about mitochondrial dysfunction that the next specialist, a team in Houston, gently disputed. The diagnoses multiplied and contradicted each other. The medications produced side effects that sometimes seemed worse than the original symptoms. One physician proposed an experimental treatment protocol. Franklin had read the risk disclosure at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday and declined with shaking hands. 10 physicians, 3 months, and his daughters were still in wheelchairs, still holding hands across the gap, still fading in ways that no one could fully explain. He had come to Hargrove on the recommendation of a colleague who had mentioned a consulting specialist with an unusual approach to pediatric cases. Franklin was not optimistic. He had stopped being optimistic somewhere around doctor number 7. But he was a father, and fathers do not stop moving. He rented the east wing of the 4th floor. He had their blankets, the exact ones, the ones they'd slept with since they were small, brought from home. He arranged for a cot in the adjoining room so he could sleep, in the loose and fitful way he had learned to sleep, within earshot of them at all times. On the first night, after the admissions process had been completed, and the nurses had finished their checks, and the building had settled into its 2 a.m. quiet, Franklin sat on the edge of his cot, with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He was not a man given to despair. He had survived too much for despair to feel like a useful option. But in that room, in that quiet, with his daughters sleeping on the other side of a wall, sleeping badly, restlessly, with small sounds that made his chest tighten every time, he sat with something very close to it. He had not told anyone. Elton Briggs had not planned to spend his life in hospital corridors. At 22, he had worked construction, the kind that built things worth seeing, framing houses in developments east of the city, hauling materials, learning the geometry of load-bearing walls, and the satisfaction of something solid rising from a foundation. He had been good at it. He had liked the physical honesty of it, the way the work showed itself clearly at the end of each day. But construction work is seasonal, and seasons have gaps, and in one of those gaps he had taken the overnight janitorial position at Hargrove Medical Center as a temporary measure. That was 11 years ago. Life had happened in the space between temporary and permanent, the way it tends to. He had met Paulette at a neighborhood cookout when he was 28, a woman with quick eyes and a laugh that arrived before she expected it to, and he had known with the same clarity he'd known about load-bearing walls that she was structural, that she was someone you built around. They had married the following year. Winnie had arrived 2 years after that, small and loud and immediately completely certain of her own importance, which made both her parents laugh so hard at the hospital that a nurse had poked her head in to check on them. For 4 years, the four of them, Elton, Paulette, Winnie, and the rented house on Clement Street, with its patch of yard and its kitchen that smelled of whatever Elton had managed to cook after his shift, had been a complete and sufficient world. Then Paulette had gotten sick. It had started the way Nora and Nell's illness had started, in its own way, gradually, quietly, with symptoms that seemed unrelated until they weren't. Fatigue, then joint pain, then a sensitivity to light that sent her to bed with the curtains drawn on bright afternoons. The doctors had taken months to agree on a name for it, a rare autoimmune condition, aggressive and poorly understood, that moved through her with terrible patience. By the time they had a diagnosis, they were already behind. Elton had fought for her the way he knew how to fight, not with eloquence or connections or the ability to summon specialists from Stockholm, but with presence. He had sat with her through every appointment. He had asked every question he could think to ask and then gone home and found more questions. He had removed every synthetic material from their home on the advice of an old family friend who was a retired nurse, a small, unscientific intervention that had, briefly, surprisingly, eased Paulette's symptoms in a way that the medications had not. It had not saved her. Nothing had saved her. She had passed away on a Thursday in March 4 years ago when Winnie was 5, gently in the room they'd shared for 6 years, with Elton holding one hand and Winnie, who did not fully understand and understood completely, holding the other. The medical bills had taken everything, the truck, the small retirement account he'd been quietly building for a decade. There was still a balance owed to a hospital 3 counties away that he paid down in increments month by month with the steady patience of someone who's decided that some debts, even unbearable ones, are going to be honored. He did not talk about Paulette often, but if you watched him closely enough, and few people did, you would notice that he sometimes stopped in the middle of mopping a hallway and stood very still, not distracted, not tired, something more internal than that. The stillness of a man on whom a memory has arrived without warning and who has learned over time to simply let it pass through him. He carried grief the way some people carry old injuries, without complaint, with adjusted gait, in a way that most people couldn't see at all. What most people also couldn't see, because they were too busy being somewhere more important, was how he paid attention to everything. To the way a family clustered differently in a waiting room when the news had been bad, to the angle of a door left open at 3 a.m. and what it suggested about the person inside, to the precise sound a child makes when they have decided that crying has stopped being worth the effort. More than a decade of overnight corridors had made Elton Briggs fluent in a language most people in that building had never needed to learn. He pushed his yellow cart. He mopped the floors, he emptied the bins and wiped the surfaces, and was, to almost everyone who passed him, invisible. And every few nights he stopped by room 412, just briefly, just for a few minutes, and sat near the doorway of 2 sick little girls who were running out of doctors. It became a rhythm, not planned, not announced, just there, the way some things become present in a life before anyone decides they should be. On the second night, Elton knocked again at 3 a.m. and found both twins awake, Nora sitting up and Nell lying on her side watching the ceiling with the settled blankness of someone who has given up negotiating with sleep. He stayed for 7 minutes. He told them about the time Winnie had convinced him, with complete seriousness, that dragonflies were the oldest living aircraft and that engineers should study them more carefully. He was not sure if this was true. Winnie had read it somewhere and delivered it with such authority that he had never thought to question it. Nell, without moving from her position on the pillow, said, "That actually might be true." Nora said, "She sounds smart." "She is, embarrassingly so. For my sake, please don't tell her I said that." Neither twin smiled, not exactly, but the blankness lifted, very slightly, the way fog lifts before you're quite sure it's lifting. On the third night, Nora asked if his daughter had ever been to a hospital. He told her yes, once for a broken wrist when Winnie was 7. And then, because Nora was watching him with the careful attention of someone who knows when an adult is leaving something out, he told her a little about Paulette. Not much, just enough, that she had been sick, that the doctors had tried, that Winnie had been very young and very brave, and that bravery at that age looks like something other people can't always recognize. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nell cried every night for the first 2 weeks. She doesn't anymore." "What about you?" Elton asked. "She cried in the mornings when she was asleep, so she wouldn't worry." Elton looked at this 7-year-old girl who had been protecting her sister from her own grief, and he felt something tighten in his chest that he recognized from the years of sitting with Paulette, the deep weight of witnessing someone carry more than they should have to carry. "You're allowed to be scared," he said. "Both of you." She nodded, not as if this was new information, more as if she had needed to hear it from someone. On the 4th night, Winnie's worn field guide to insects, a battered paperback she had been collecting facts from since she was 6, was in Elton's work bag, left there absently that morning when Winnie had been showing him something and he had run late and simply grabbed the bag and gone. He pulled it out absently when Nora asked about dragonflies again and set it on the bed. What happened next was for Franklin Aldridge, standing unseen in the adjoining room at 3:24 a.m., the most significant thing he had witnessed in 3 months. Both twins were awake, both of them leaning over the same book, passing it back and forth, their heads close together, pointing at illustrations and disagreeing, cheerfully and animatedly, with the full-throated confidence of children who are certain they are right about whether a distinct species of beetle was ugly or interesting. "It's clearly ugly," Nell said. "It's interesting," Nora said. "Those are not the same thing. Ugly things aren't interesting. That is the most wrong thing you've ever said." Franklin stood in the doorway, and his throat closed. He had not heard them argue in 2 months. Arguing required energy, the bright, sparkling energy of children who are still fully present in the world, still invested in being right, still certain enough about their own opinions to defend them. He had watched that energy drain out of them so gradually over 3 months that he had almost stopped noticing its absence. It was back, briefly, partially, tentatively, but back. He stood there for a long time after Elton had said goodnight and moved on with his cart. He stood there looking at his daughters, who had fallen asleep with the field guide open between them, Nell's hand resting on a page about beetles. The next morning he found out the janitor's name. Franklin Aldridge was a man who, when he introduced himself, shook hands firmly and looked people directly in the eye with the focused attention of someone who has learned that seeing people is a form of respect. He found Elton at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, returning the insect field guide he had retrieved from their daughter's room. Elton, who had spent 11 years understanding exactly how visible he was in places like this, assumed he was about to be reprimanded. He began composing an apology. "Don't," Franklin said, before a word came out. "Don't." Elton waited. Franklin looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who is choosing his words carefully, because the wrong ones will not carry the weight of what he means. "I've spent 3 months watching specialists look at my daughters like they were puzzles. Last night was the first time I've seen them argue about beetles." He paused. "You looked at them like children." Elton didn't say anything. He wasn't sure anything was required. "What's your name?" "Elton. Elton Briggs." Franklin shook his hand, slowly, the way you shake the hand of someone you were genuinely meeting for the first time, even if you have been watching them for days. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," he said. It happened on the 6th night. Nora had the insect guide open to a page about dragonfly larvae,
a subject she had become in the past 4 nights a surprisingly authoritative on, and Elton was half listening, half watching Nell, who was drifting in and out of sleep, her breathing slower and more settled than it had been earlier in the week. Progress. Small, undramatic, impossible to measure in any chart or report, but Elton had spent enough time in this doorway to know what he was seeing. They had been talking, in the loose, unhurried way of people who are comfortable in silence and therefore don't need to fill it, about what the twins had been like before they got sick. Nora described a Saturday last spring when she and Nell had convinced their father to cancel a board call to take them to a botanical garden, and how he had spent 2 hours pretending to care about flowers while they ran ahead and came back to report on things they'd found. Her voice, when she talked about it, had a quality that Elton recognized, the brightness of a good memory that hasn't yet been made sad by what came after. He told her about Paulette. Not much, not the medical details, not the grief, not the weight of it, just the shape of her, lightly sketched. Her laugh, the way she had moved through a room with a certainty that made other people feel certain too. He mentioned, almost in passing, the way you mention something when there is no agenda, when the words are simply finding their own way out, that in the months before her diagnosis, when the doctors were still disagreeing about what to call what was happening to her, they had removed everything synthetic from their home. An old friend of ours was a retired nurse, he said. She'd seen some unusual cases in her time. She said sometimes the body is reacting to something in its environment, something that isn't a disease, so the doctors aren't looking for it as a cause. She said it couldn't hurt to try. He was quiet for a moment. It didn't save Paulette. Whatever was already happening in her system, it had gone too far by then. But the symptoms eased for a while, in a way the medications hadn't managed. He said it the way you say something when you are not saying it as advice, when you are simply sitting with someone else's difficulty and want to offer something, not a solution, not an opinion, just a fragment of your own experience, which is all any of us really have to offer. He didn't see Franklin. Franklin was standing at the far edge of the doorway, further back than usual, in the shadows of the adjoining room where he had been standing for the past 4 minutes. He had come in to check on the girls and found the door open and heard voices and had not wanted to interrupt. He heard every word.
When Elton finished and said goodnight and moved on with his cart, Franklin stood in the dark room for a long moment, his daughters breathing softly on the other side of the wall. Then he went to the small desk in the corner, turned on the lamp, and took out his notepad. The conversation with the lead physician happened the next morning. Franklin had spent the night organizing his thoughts in the precise way he organized everything, not emotionally, but structurally, building the question from its foundation the way you build an argument. He was not angry. He was not accusatory. He sat across from the physician in the consultation room and said, with the calm resolve of someone who has made a decision before walking into the room, "I want to know whether the girls have been fully tested for environmental triggers." The physician, a careful, thorough man who was not used to being surprised by patient families, paused. Specifically, Franklin continued, hypersensitivity to compounds they may have been exposed to in their environment, not as a symptom of an underlying condition, as the cause. There was a silence. "Our workup has been extensive," the physician said. "I'm sure it has," Franklin said. "I'm asking whether it was exhaustive in that particular direction." Another silence, longer this time. "I want it to be, whatever it takes." What followed was 2 days of testing more thorough and targeted than anything the twins had undergone in 3 months of appointments. Environmental panels, exposure analyses, detailed interviews about the physical spaces the girls had inhabited in the months before they became ill. The answer, when it arrived, was so quiet and precise that it almost seemed like the wrong scale for the size of the problem it explained. 6 months earlier, the Aldrich home had undergone a partial renovation, new flooring and wall paneling in the east wing, where the girls' bedrooms were located. The materials used were a synthetic composite newly introduced to the luxury renovation market, beautiful, expensive, and, for a rare subset of individuals with a defined genetic sensitivity, quietly and cumulatively toxic. Both the girls, it turned out, shared that sensitivity. Their bodies had been responding to a slow, invisible accumulation of exposure, not to a disease, not to a pathogen, not to anything that showed up on the standard diagnostic panels that 10 physicians had run, to a material, in their walls, in their floors, in the room where they slept every night. The specialist from Stockholm, reached by phone, called the identification of the trigger a remarkably astute clinical intuition. He meant it as a compliment to the medical team. Franklin listened to him say it and said nothing. He knew exactly where the intuition had come from.
The improvement did not happen overnight. That is not how recovery works. Not the real kind, not the kind that holds. The first week was cautious. The girls were moved to a clean environment. Their exposure to synthetic compounds was carefully controlled. The medical team put a support protocol in place, targeted, finally aimed at the right thing. The physicians were attentive, thorough, doing everything correctly now that they had a direction. Franklin did not fault them for not finding it sooner. He had spent a sleepless night working through whether to be angry and had decided, somewhere around 4 a.m., that anger was a cost he couldn't afford right now. What he watched instead was his daughters. In the first week, small things. Nell sleeping through the night, 2 nights in a row, without the trembling episodes that had been waking her since October. Nora eating breakfast without being coaxed, finishing most of it, asking what was for lunch before she'd set down her fork. In the second week, less small things. Color returning to their faces, not fully, not dramatically, but present, the way color returns to a room when someone opens a curtain they had forgotten was closed. On a Saturday morning in the third week, Nell asked for pancakes. She ate 2 full plates. Franklin sat across from her at the small table in the hospital room, watching her eat with the focused, unapologetic appetite of a child who has rediscovered hunger, and he could not speak for a full minute. He sat there with his coffee going cold and his throat tight and something building behind his eyes that he managed, barely, to keep contained, because his daughters were watching, and he had decided some time ago that they needed him to be steady. "Good?" he managed. Nell looked up from her plate. "More syrup," she said. He laughed. A real one, sudden and unprepared for, the kind that arrives before you can compose it. It had been a long time since he had laughed like that. 3 weeks after the environmental trigger was identified, the lead physician sat down with Franklin and walked him through the data with the careful precision of someone who understood what he was looking at now that he knew where to look. The markers were moving in the right direction. The trajectory was clear. With continued management of exposure and a monitored recovery period, the prognosis was good. "How good?" Franklin asked. "Very," the physician said. Franklin nodded. He had trained himself in the past 3 months not to let good news land too hard. The fall from hope had become too familiar. But this time, sitting in that consultation room with the data in front of him and Nell's 2 empty pancake plates in his memory, he let it land. He let it be true. Discharge day arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 4 days after the twins had been rolled through the entrance in their pale blue sweaters, holding hands. They walked out. Not running, they were still recovering, still careful, still carrying the aftermath of 3 months of illness in their bodies, but walking. Beside each other, not gripping each other, with the slightly looser posture of children who no longer need to hold on quite so tightly. Franklin had already arranged for the east wing of the house to be gutted and rebuilt using fully cleared materials. He had already briefed his estate manager. He had already scheduled the follow-up appointments. He was a man who, once he knew what to do, did it with his full weight. But before they left, he asked to speak with Elton privately. Elton came to the family lounge on the 4th floor, in his gray uniform, his cart parked in the hallway. He had heard, through the quiet channels of hospital life, that the twins were going home. He was glad. He thought about telling Franklin so. He was also, based on 11 years of professional habit, already constructing an apology for crossing whatever lines he might have crossed. Franklin stopped him before he could start. "I've already spoken with the hospital administration," he said. "I've made some arrangements." He paused, the way he paused when he was delivering information he wanted to land clearly. "I'm funding a pediatric wellness center, new facility, independent, focused on the intersection of environment, family experience, and patient recovery. The things that medicine knows matter, but doesn't always know how to address." Elton waited. "I don't have a medical degree," he said. It was not an argument. It was just true, and he felt it needed to be said. "I know that," Franklin said. "I'm not hiring you for a medical degree." He looked at Elton steadily. "I'm hiring you because you know how to see people.
Because you walked past a door at 3 a.m. and heard something everyone else had stopped listening for. Because you sat down with my daughters when they had nothing left, and you looked at them like they were worth looking at. He extended his hand. There are not enough people in medicine who know how to do that. I'd like to build a place where that's considered essential.
Elton looked at the extended hand. He thought about 11 years of overnight corridors, about yellow mop carts and antiseptic, and being unnoticed in the way people like him are trained to be unnoticed in places like that. He thought about Paulette, about the way she had moved through a room, about a retired nurse's advice that he had followed not because he understood the science, but because someone had looked at him and his situation and said, "I see you. Here is something that might help." He thought about Winnie, asleep in a rented house on Clement Street, 9 years old and gap-toothed and obsessed with dragonflies, who deserved a father who was not always counting the balance owed to a hospital 3 counties over. He shook Franklin Aldridge's hand. The card arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after discharge. A standard white envelope, handwritten address, slightly uneven letters, the careful printing of children who were still learning that the world expects them to communicate in straight lines. Elton found it in the mailbox when he came home from his last overnight shift at Hargrove before the new position began. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a sketch pad, with the faint grid lines of a school art block visible in the texture. Both girls had drawn dragonflies, careful, slightly crooked, rendered with the absolute commitment of artists who know their technical skills are limited but refuse to let that stop them. There were 4 dragonflies in total. 2 drawn in blue crayon, 2 in green, each one distinct in the way the children make things distinct when they are trying very hard. Below the drawings, in handwriting that Elton would later learn was Nora's, slightly smaller, slightly more deliberate than her sister's, was a note. "These are the best we could do. We tried very hard. We thought Winnie might like them. Thank you for stopping. Nora and Nell." Elton read it twice. Then he sat with it for a moment. Winnie was at school. She would be home by 3:15. He would show her then, would watch her take the card with both hands, the way she took things she considered important, would hear whatever she said about the dragonflies, and whether they were anatomically accurate, she would have opinions, would see her carry it to the refrigerator without being asked, and find the right magnet. He knew his daughter. He looked at the refrigerator across the kitchen. There was a photograph already there, held by a magnet shaped like a sunflower, slightly faded from years in the same spot. Paulette, at a backyard cookout the summer before Winnie was born, laughing at something outside the frame, unaware she was being photographed, entirely herself. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about 11 years of overnight corridors, the antiseptic smell, the 2 a.m. quiet that was never peaceful, the familiar low squeak of a yellow cart in an empty hallway. He thought about how Paulette used to say that the smallest decisions carry the most weight, not the grand ones, not the ones you make with full awareness of their importance, but the unplanned ones, the instinctive ones, the ones you make at 3 a.m. because something in you refuses, just this once, to keep walking. He thought about the night he had paused outside room 412, heard a sound that everyone else had learned not to hear, and stood in a doorway instead of moving on. He had not saved those girls. He had not diagnosed anything, had not prescribed anything, had not done anything that would appear in any medical record or clinical summary. He had just stopped. He had just listened. He had just told a scared child about dragonflies in the middle of the night, and told a grieving father in passing about the small and imperfect things people do when medicine has run out of answers. Sometimes the smallest things are the only things that fit through the door that's left open. He was not a doctor. He had never claimed to be. But Paulette had taught him, through the years of her illness, through the patience of her dying, through the way she had faced both with a grace he had spent 4 years trying to understand, that the most important skill in any room full of suffering is not the one that comes with a degree. It is the willingness to be fully present, to look at a person, not at their chart, not at their diagnosis, not at their usefulness or their status or their ability to be solved, but at the actual, irreplaceable person in front of you, to see them,
Winnie came home at 3:22 p.m. and dropped her backpack by the door and said, "Did anything come in the mail?" Because she had been expecting a book about insects she had ordered with her birthday money, and she had the focused impatience of someone awaiting an important delivery. "Something better," Elton said, and handed her the card. She opened it carefully, looked at the dragonflies for a long time. "These aren't anatomically perfect," she said. "The wing proportion is off." "I know. But they tried really hard." She looked up at him. "Can I put it on the refrigerator?" "That's exactly where it goes," he said. She found a magnet, the one shaped like a small blue star that she had picked out herself at a rest stop 3 years ago, and fixed the card to the refrigerator door. She stepped back and looked at it, then at the photograph of Paulette beside it, then back at the card. "Do you think they're better now?" she asked. "The twins?" "They are," he said. She nodded with the satisfied certainty of someone receiving information they had already decided was going to be true. "Good," she said, and went to get a snack. Elton stood in the kitchen a moment longer looking at the refrigerator, at the dragonfly card and the sunflower magnet and the faded photograph of a woman laughing at something outside the frame. He thought, "I see you, Paulette. I'm still paying attention." Then he went to make dinner. And that is the story of Elton Briggs, the man who swept floors and carried the world. Not a doctor, not a specialist, just a man who stopped when everyone else kept walking. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who showed up quietly, who saw you when you needed to be seen, leave a comment below. Tell us about them. And if you're new to Everhart Tales, welcome home. Subscribe and come back next time. There's always another story worth telling. Always.